To explore this world of hi-fi and audiophiles as they call it, I've got with me Jude. And Jude is pretty much a legend in the audio enthusiast community. He runs the Revolver Club, which sells vinyl, hi-fi audio gear, does complete sound and home theater installations, and has played a very important role in this growing community. And we'll talk to Jude right after these short messages.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus Meghnad, Shreyas and Abbas discuss Vijay Mallya getting sentenced to jail for 4 months and fined 2,000 rupees for contempt of court. On Ikka Dukka Economy, Abhinav explains how the fiscal credentials of the government work. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explains the difference and importance of time in the market versus timing in the market. The Wire Talks host Siddharth Bhatia talks to history professor and secretary of JNU, Professor R. Mahalakshmi. The duo decode the ongoing Kali movie poster controversy. And on Marathi Khirki Tanda Deshmukhs recite Marathi writer Purushottam Shivram Rege's poem Anpahat Hota. Before I leave, I just want to remind you all that we have some amazing merchandise for you guys. Please go to our website, click on the shop tab, and check out the collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any other platforms you're listening to us. And remember, you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey which helps us understand who you all are, our listeners. And we'd really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Boat Lifestyle, Small Case, Capgemini, and Intel vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hey Jude, welcome to Aneesh Thing.
Thanks for having me, Anish.
I'm sure you never heard this before, someone saying hey Jude to you.
No, I haven't.
Well, we've been talking for a while. You've helped me a lot in my hi-fi journey, and I think we'll be able to do that for a lot of people today. So just to get right into things, what is this world of hi-fi and what is this whole term audiophile?
Okay. Fairly sort of complicated answer, but I'll try and keep it as simple as I can. I don't like the word audiophile. I think audiophile has created almost a sort of an elitist type of, and a level of intimidation among people who potentially, want to get into this whole hobby. I prefer music lover. I think that it's grown considerably over the last maybe 3 or 4 years. I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that obviously we have the internet and we have social media. People travel a lot, so you get access to reviews, etc., and also the ability to maybe travel abroad and pick it up. Pricing is still an issue in India. It's still a relatively speaking expensive hobby. Though one could make the an argument that there's no real affordable hobby anymore. Most hobbies are expensive, relatively speaking. I think that if you enjoy listening to music, then I consider you to be quote unquote an audiophile. I think that it doesn't matter whether you have a 5 lakh system or a 50,000 rupee system or maybe even good headphones. I think my focus when I started the Revolver Club was just to let people know that music can sound a lot better. Things that happened over time with the advent of CDs and then obviously moving on to MP3, where all of a sudden once MP3 kicked in, there was no, especially initially, there was no difference between sort of a 64 kbps, utter trash recording and a 320 VBR. I'm getting technical here, but for a while it was MP3. There was no distinction of good MP3 and bad MP3. I'm not sort of hating on MP3s. I think MP3s can sound very good, but that happened for a while. And I think another thing that happened is that the commoditization of things like headphones and speakers, where we emphasize on things like extra bass, and then that became sort of a sign of a good audio system. Does that thump hit your chest? And that's going to take a while to change. And I think
unlearn in a way.
Yeah. And I think you've seen that in most other facets of sort of culture, like so food, for example. Food's a great example, right? There were restaurants in my neighborhood that was considered, when I was a kid, the place to go for dinner. Italian, quote unquote. Now I wouldn't go there if you paid me, because it's clearly not Italian. It's like an Indianized Italian. So things have changed overall. I think the hi-fi community, the audiophile community is growing daily. I think that it's no longer a very unaffordable hobby to get into. It's not necessarily cheap, but I don't think it's something that will stop a lot of people from getting in. And I think it provides a level of relaxation that is really unsurpassed when it comes to anything else. I think, unwinding after a long day, listening to a good music, a music system, or listening to music on a good set of headphones for that matter, can alleviate stress, all those kinds of things. So, to answer your question, the community is growing. There's lots of ways to enter the hobby without breaking the bank. And if there's any time that, I don't think there's a better time to get into this hobby than there is right now.
That is exactly what I was coming to, right? I think 2022 is the best year to get into this hobby. So many things are more affordable, more accessible.
Yes.
Even streaming services, we have access to all that music. In India, Apple's got high-res audio now.
Yes.
And a lot of these things were just not the case. And like what you said, this hobby, you just end up relaxing, and it's a very satisfying hobby.
Yeah.
And somewhere even, collecting albums, those sort of things have made a comeback. And you sell a lot of vinyl. I think if you can tell me a little bit more about the vinyl phenomena.
So obviously vinyl is now the in thing. It's maybe been the in thing for the last couple of years at least. It's growing tremendously. You probably read articles all the time talking about vinyl and its comeback. I think there's two ways to really look at this. I think the first way is, older school collectors will say vinyl never really died. There was always a niche audience that continued to purchase vinyl, specifically abroad. So I'm talking, when I say abroad, I mean Europe and North America. I think vinyl never died. I think there were a lot of guys still picking up stuff, hardcore collectors, hardcore sort of record collectors. Then I think the advent of Record Store Day. So Record Store Day was basically an event thrown by independent record stores once a year to sort of push, and help independent record stores that were going out of business. I don't think that's a reflection of vinyl dying. I think that was a reflection of generally retail changing into sort of online platforms where a lot of the smaller guys couldn't compete anymore. Amazon entered, etc., etc. And so Record Store Day, which I think started maybe 20 odd years ago, was one of the things that really helped. Record Store Day, unfortunately, has turned into trash now.
Okay.
It's become a sort of a scalper's market.
I was just going to say, aren't you the India partners for Record
I am. But it is unfortunately become trash because A, we don't get a lot of stuff. India's fairly low on the, hey, we need to send you stuff. And B, it's become a scalper's market. So what happens is people buy and then resell on eBay. So somewhat along the lines of shoes.
Yeah.
Which is really annoying because, there's nothing more worse than seeing that happen. I've unfortunately had to sometimes buy stuff that I really wanted at double the rate, simply because it was all sold out.
Yeah, so resales happening in vinyl as well.
Exactly. So I feel that's really sort of died, sort of killed it for me. Though it's still, generally speaking, a huge event, internationally speaking, and I'll continue to do it in India also. I think that part of also what's happened is I think it's maybe slightly cyclical in the sense that people were getting bored of streaming. I think a lot of young people value, physical ownership for one. Being able to touch and feel that record. I think B, the other aspects of records, which is one, having to listen to the entire album.
Oh yeah.
Something that's died out. Most people listen to a single song. That can sometimes be a big deal. I sometimes have this habit of cutting a track short, and then you've got people screaming at you, let the track play. I think records are as close to as what the artist intended as possible, because there's a reason they had that track listing. There's a reason this track was one, and there's a reason this track ended the album. I think that opening up an album, listening, looking at the notes inside, I think those are things that appeal to a lot of people now, simply because life has become so digitalized. And I think people want a break. And so I think that's one of the reasons that I liked vinyl. When I got into vinyl, it wasn't necessarily just about the sound quality, because I was listening, my initial records were on a fairly trashy system. For me, it was, so I had a phase when I was younger where I really got into Zeppelin. Okay. And there were talks about how Stairway to Heaven, if played backwards, was a satanic song. Yeah. And 17-year-old Jude really had his brain blown, because the devil and the occult and Aleister Crowley. So I devoted myself to finding the record, getting a turntable, and then trying to play it backwards. And then, that's how it started for me. It wasn't I want to be an audiophile. It was, this is cool, and just the whole thing of moving the arm and dropping it down, etc., etc. That was really, really cool for me, and that's how it really started. And then after that, I started realizing that, hey, records sound better than CDs. At that point, CDs were the thing. And so sort of, I think the same thing has happened to a lot of people. And fortunately for us, initially when I started Revolver Club, it was a lot of oldies that got into records. So it was either established collectors or collectors that sort of collected vinyl back in the day that had thrown it out to a Bangarwala that now wanted to get back in. Now, my audience is a lot of young people. So I'm selling a lot of Ariana Grande and Taylor Swift, things that, I don't really listen to. But I feel really happy because, there's only so many copies of Dark Side of the Moon that you can sell.
Of course.
After a while, it gets a little, like I had a guy come over for a demo the other day and he said, can I listen to Hotel California? And I said, no, you can't. because I'm sort of sick of that song. And I think one of the cool things about records now is that it's not just those few albums that are coming out. You can get anything.
I've got some really weird stuff from you
Okay.
that I've purchased. I've purchased Ram Lakhan
Correct.
on vinyl. And a lot of people ask, why would you ever do that? But hey, why not? I also have Diler Mehendi on vinyl from you.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's just fun, weird stuff to have.
So we sell a lot of records to specifically 45 RPM singles to foreigners abroad who are typically DJs.
Yeah.
Who will use that to sample. So there's a variety of sort of uses, and Indian Bollywood specifically and Hindustani classical stuff on vinyl is very is more than sort of just ownership. It's also an investment because those things are not going to be repressed again.
That is super interesting.
A lot of those masters have literally burned to the ground, or have been. India doesn't have a community. We don't respect a lot of our stuff that we have. So there's no real archiving of older pressings, etc. So anything that you own that's an original pressing is now essentially a sort of a cultural artifact.
And at resale, what prices are we looking at? Let's say really coveted.
So let me put it this way. When I started this business, you could get a good copy of Sholay for about $1,000. You'd be hard pressed to find a good copy in good condition for anything less than $4 now.
Wow, okay.
And obviously some of that is also skewed by, dickhead dealers who keep sort of hoarding, who keep hoarding records and are in a way destroying the market. That eventually will, I feel, sort of adjust itself simply because I think people are getting smart and they realize that that's not necessarily the value of a record, and it's been sort of artificially pumped up. But for those who are planning on getting into this hobby, it would be a good idea to invest in these, iconic Bollywood and Hindustani classical albums, because you're not going to find them again. Or if you do find them, they're going to be sold by a shady label where they've used the CD as the master and they're pushing it as a record.
Got it. So later in the episode, we're going to get into setting up a system. But one thing I wanted to talk about vinyl right now itself is the quality, the audio quality, right? And a lot of people automatically assume that a vinyl will sound better, which at least I think we know is not the case. All vinyls may not sound well depending on condition, this, that. And the second question that I get a lot, especially when I play Daft Punk on vinyl, is that what's the point of vinyl, because it's a digital album to begin with.
Okay.
And at least to me, playing Daft Punk on high-res Apple Music or Tidal versus vinyl, it does sound different. So why is that a digital album on vinyl can also sound different, if not better? I think better is a subjective term, but it can sound different. Why is that?
So specifically to Daft Punk Random Access Memories, that's not quite accurate. Because if you read about the production behind Random Access Memories, they spent close to $1 million recording that in mostly analog. So it is basically an analog recording. The difference is that there's not many bands out there who can afford to spend $1 million to have it, to use the best equipment to record it in analog. Other bands that do this are the White Stripes, for example. Very basic systems, but fully analog. So in the case of the White Stripes, that's not quite true. But there are other bands, obviously, modern bands that record fully digital that are pressed onto record. My feeling is that it's about the nuances when it comes to records. Okay, the first thing that you mentioned is that all pressings are different. So specifically older stuff, a UK pressing, a US pressing, a French pressing, and an Indian pressing will almost definitely sound totally different.
Can you explain what a pressing is?
So a record is made with a stamper. There's literally a mold made with the grooves cut in, and these are stamped into sort of hot vinyl. The initial pressings, as in the initial, say maybe 800 stamps, will sound better than the last 800 stamps. So in fact, you have a whole type of sort of demographic lusting after hot stampers, which are basically the first maybe 500 stamps.
How do you figure it out?
There's ways to check it out based on the notes on the label, etc.
Okay.
So that's another complicated thing. More than that, a huge deal on what systems on what the record will sound like is based on the system that you have. So now if you play it on a very basic system, so I get this a lot, right? I'm not trying to sort of demean anybody, but specifically guys who buy an entry-level turntable, making assessments on the record quality is pointless, because it's not. You can't. You've got a basic system and you've hooked it up to a small little Bose soundbar.
Yeah.
So for people like that to make statements has to be taken with not a pinch of salt, but like a handful of salt. So that's one thing that people need to remember, is that till you get to a basic, an entry-level audiophile system, which will set you back anywhere between maybe 75 and a lakh, it's very hard for you to make assessments on what the sound quality is like. So a lot of people may buy an entry-level system and then say, I don't really see how this sounds better than my CD or my MP3. And unfortunately, the answer there is, boss, you don't have a good enough system right now. Or potentially you don't have the ability to tell. There are some people who are just straight up deaf. It's very rare that it happens, but there are some people who just can't tell the difference, in which case they've lucked out, because you never have to invest in a fancy system. So in the case, getting back to your question, it's too voluminous a sort of question to say, how do you decide what pressing is good and not? It comes down to the pressing type, it comes down to the equipment, it comes down to your exposure to audio. The example I use is, if you sat in a C-class, the C-class is the best car, till you sit in an S-class, and then all of a sudden the C-class is nothing. It's the same thing with audio. It's a matter of exposure. It's a matter of, just being out there, listening to systems, seeing, people throw out terms like, buy a tube amp, it'll sound warmer. Don't buy those speakers. They're too, neutral. These are very, very sort of weird assessments that people make, because another thing that people throw out is all records are warm. Records have a warm to them. That's total bullshit. There are a lot of pressings out there that are very cold, if that's the appropriate word. So it has nothing to do with, there's no one single thing. There's too many sort of variables. And my thing is that don't get into that. Don't get into this hyper analyzation of what you're listening to. It destroys the hobby. Listen to it. The best thing that can happen, at least for me, is when I listen to something new in a track that I've listened to 100 times. When you hear that little cowbell in the corner, that's when listen, there's a new level of detail that I've been exposed to. That will happen as a result of, active listening, actually being able to pay attention, and potentially a better sounding system.
This exact line what you said, for me, this is the crux of the whole hobby. When you listen to a track again, which you must have heard how many hundreds of times, and you just hear one more detail, that absolutely genuinely blows your mind.
Yes. That's what it is. I think that's basically, that's the definition of an audiophile.
Yeah.
I think it's always been that for me, is that I've listened to a track for so long. I recently was listening to a Queens of the Stone Age track, and all of a sudden I heard this little sort of guitar outro in one of the tracks that I just never heard. And I was like, wow, that's cool. After 15 years of listening to this album, I still discovered something new, and it wasn't a fancy setup. I actually was on my headphones.
For me, this was again comfortably numb. I got the vinyl from Revolver Club only recently, played that, and actually messaged a lot of my friends saying, listen, I've never heard comfortably numb like this. And then the next morning I was like, wait, was I a little high and I was getting over emotional about this? But then I heard it again and I was like, yeah, I've heard this song how many times, but I'm
So
just
that's
getting
another
more out
thing.
of it.
That's another thing that you've rightly brought up. See, substances also help. So I won't get into what substances, but substances along with the right music system can mean.
Okay,
you know-
that I did not think we would get into. Substance and system pairing. Okay, so you spoke about a few terms of warm and cold and stuff like that in the pressings. I think we'll touch upon a little more about the jargons thrown around in the space after a small little break.
Sure.
Hello, hello, hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus Meghnad, Shreyas, and Abbas discuss Vijay Mallya getting sentenced to jail for 4 months and fined 2,000 rupees for contempt of court. On Ikka Dukka Economy, Abhinav explains how the fiscal credentials of the government work. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explains the difference and importance of time in the market versus timing in the market. The Wire Talks host Siddharth Bhatia talks to history professor and secretary of JNU, Professor R. Mahalakshmi. The duo decode the ongoing Kali movie poster controversy. And on Marathi Khirki Tanda Deshmukh's recite Marathi writer Purushottam Shivram Rege's poem Anpahat Hota. Before I leave, I just want to remind you all that we have some amazing merchandise for you guys. Please go to our website, click on the shop tab, and check out the collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any other platforms you're listening to us. And remember, you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey which helps us understand who you all are, our listeners. And we'd really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Boat Lifestyle, Small Case, Capgemini, and Intel vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Okay, Jude, let's talk about some of the jargons thrown in the space. Transparency, warm, cold. Tell me a few more of these and what it means.
My take on sort of this hi-fi lingo is two things broadly speaking. One is I think it was made by hi-fi writers to sort of, write flowery reviews about why certain gear is better than the other. And I think B, it again provides a level of intimidation to clientele. And I think that from a sales perspective, it's always good to build this level of intimidation to almost tell a client, you don't quite have it right now. You don't really understand what you're picking up. Trust me. I've seen this strategy being used by a lot of hi-fi guys. Right? They'll say, you don't really get it right now. Trust me. The transparency is open. The soundstage is now more tighter. The bass is less wobbly. The separation is better. I would say to a certain extent, a lot of this is common sense. Okay, soundstage is, in my opinion, how sort of natural does it sound as you may have been listening to that band in real life? Does it seem like it's coming from almost like a stage in front of you as opposed to spread out all over? I think sort of sound separation is being able to examine each instrument sort of separately by themselves. I think warmth is basically bullshit. I don't even know what that means.
Okay.
So I've stopped saying words like warmth. I get really annoyed if my blood pressure starts going up and people say warm and cold, etc. Because like I mentioned earlier, that's totally dependent on the pressing and there's so many variables there, and I really don't know what warm means. I really don't. I've had clients who have called me and said, Jude, I don't feel the warmth. And what they mean by warmth is they don't hear any crackle or pops. The assumption is when you pick up a record, that's what it should sound like. I said, boss, you have to get your record a little dirty and then you start getting the warmth. So these are things that have been put into people's head. It's marketing lingo. So I avoid any, if when I'm making a sales pitch, I'm very against using these words. And a relatable sort of Indian term would be, a lot of older guys will talk about RMS and PMPO.
Oh, PMPO. I remember that on so many sound systems.
Exactly. So it was one of those things that some marketer sat down with his buddies and they were like, how do we, we're going to use the word PMPO and then we're going to say RMS and we're going to confuse people and then people are going to say, what's the rating on RMS? I get older clients who even now, who are buying a fancy system will say, but what's the RMS on this? And I say, I don't know. Because I truly don't, and it doesn't matter.
I remember all your Sonys and Sansois and everything had PMPOs written on it.
In fact, when I got my IVA system when I was like 12 or 15, I was really concerned about that. I said, but what about the PMPO? There's a big sticker that says 1000 watts PMPO. I was like, that's the one we need. So I think that's that RMS PMPO example is the best analogy for modern day stereo, separation and warmth and these kinds of things. It's basically a big hoopla to get people to feel better about themselves, especially on the really high-end stuff. See, India doesn't have the really high-end community yet. There are pockets of guys, but there's no, like if you go abroad, there are serious stores out there, okay? A store where you could buy a $500,000 system. A $500,000 system in India is most likely going to be a home theater. There's no value for music. So in order to sell those kinds of systems, that's where these words come out. So if you log on to a Stereophile, you'll see this flowery language where a guy at the end of it, he's a lot of the time sort of taken by the whole spiel.
Yeah, the spiel.
The spiel. It's basically spiel. I guess that's the best way for me to put it. It's basically spiel. And I think that I tell people not to worry about things like this. When I, for example, push a speaker, I basically call speakers either hi-fi or non-hi-fi. Hi-fi means very accurate. Non-hi-fi means the bass is generally slightly accentuated.
Got it.
And that's the easiest way to explain to a customer rather than me getting into...
When I was asking you about the magnets, you told me they're a fun party speaker.
Yeah. Or rock and roll speaker.
Yeah, rock and roll speaker.
They're made for Zeppelin and AC/DC
yeah.
Because they've got the double firing woofer. So they provide a level of bass that you can't get from normal speakers. But that comes at a cost, and this will always happen. Bass will come at a cost of refinement. So you pick one of the two. It's very hard to get both.
Got it.
In my opinion, again. Yeah. And I should clarify that whatever I'm saying here is strictly my opinion. There's a lot of guys who are going to be, like Jude's talking nonsense.
But I think that way, audio is subjective to begin with, right?
It is.
What sounds good to me may not sound good to you and vice versa.
Yeah.
I think this is a good point to also talk about setting up your first hi-fi system.
Yeah.
I think if we can look at two examples, one, what would be a base entry-level affordable sort of a system,
right,
and perhaps one jump up to that.
So when you're looking at a system, there's basically 3 or 4 components we need to talk about. One is the source. So the source can be a record player. The source can be a CD player. The source, nowadays, things that are getting popular are streamers for digital streaming, via an Apple Music or so and so. Then you've got the amplification. Obviously, the amplifier powers your speakers. And then you've got the speakers. And then last and least important are the cables. As an entry-level system, we combine the amplifier and speaker into a single unit, commonly referred to as an active speaker or a powered speaker, meaning that the amplification is built into the speaker. So that's usually the way to go when you're starting off. Don't invest in a passive setup because a passive setup will always, sort of increase the price point. So there's a fairly popular brand that you see on Amazon a lot called Edifier. Now, Edifier is Chinese, and, we have this Chinese, anti-Chinese thing going on, and Chinese goods are cheap, etc. But they are, in my opinion, the best value for money sort of powered speaker there in the market. So the 1280 dB and the 1700 BT, priced at 10 and I think 13,000, generally speaking, that's the speaker to start with. So these are fully powered speakers, 2 of them, obviously a pair. They have various inputs, including optical and an RCA to connect your record player or whatever. They also come with Bluetooth. So they're also fairly convenient in terms of pairing up with an iPhone or an iPad or whatever. And then in terms of record player, pick one of the basics. They're basically all made in the same factory. They have different chappas on them. So it's a Denon, a Marantz, an Audio-Technica or a Pioneer, depending on basically what's available in the market at that point and what's cheapest. Because they're all the same.
And they use the same cartridge.
Same cartridge, same tone arm, same motor, same bearing, same everything. Made in the same factory by the same guys, just with a different logo. People find this hard to believe. So, for example, the Audio-Technica LP60X is very, very popular. It's no different from a Denon DP20NF, which would be $3,000 cheaper. What does differ are looks. And one could make the argument that the LP60X looks more modern. And so for that reason, people tend to pick that. That's really the way to start. That's going to set you back anywhere from 25 to 30 grand, depending on the turntable that you pick. That's what we call at the Revolver Club an enthusiast pack.
Got it.
it's the Honda City of systems. There are better systems out there, but in terms of value for money, reliability, that's where you should start. The only thing that will go wrong with that system is you're going to break the stylus, the cartridge.
On the turntable.
On the turntable. Yeah. Other than that, there's really nothing that can go wrong. These things can take a fair amount of abuse. So, yeah.
What's the level up to this?
After this, we go and we look at amplifier, a dedicated amplifier with speakers, and obviously a turntable or a CD player or a streamer. So the second system is, the passive system. We now move on to a dedicated amplifier and a dedicated set of speakers with the same set of sources. So the sources, again, CD player, record player, or streamer. Amplifier obviously powers the speakers. Amplifier is generally two types. You've got a very basic amplifier, which is analog inputs. You've got a slightly fancier amplifier with built-in streaming like Wi-Fi, etc., which gives you the convenience of both. You also have what they call two-channel receivers. Two-channel receivers are stereo amplifiers with a subwoofer input and HDMI.
Okay, explain that again.
What's happening now is a stereo amp typically is just for audio, okay? But a lot of people want to buy systems now that can also accentuate or better their TV sound. Because let's be honest, TV sound is garbage. And so usually when you buy a TV, they make you buy a shitty sound bar or something along those lines. You can buy a decent AV a two-channel receiver, which is a stereo setup, but with HDMI. So your TV sound will also process through the amplifier. So you kill two birds with one stone. So you can watch a movie. You won't get a surround sound experience, but it'll definitely give you, the volume and bass that a lot of people associate with a good sort of personal cinema experience. So that is another sort of something that we're seeing from a lot of clients now. Hey, can I hook up my TV? Because, obviously no one wants to invest in another soundbar for the house, for the TV, and then another setup, especially in Bombay where we've got small houses, etc. So the amplifier will now hook up to speakers. Speakers, broadly speaking, you've got two types of speakers. You've got a bookshelf speaker and you've got a floor standing speaker. Bookshelves are, as the name suggests, small and to be placed on bookshelves or stands. Floor standing speakers or tower speakers are the big boys you've seen, at people's houses, etc. The big difference is their ability to move air. Small speakers move less air, obviously, than large speakers. This will translate into usually more bass on a larger speaker and a more, presence of sound. Hard for me to quantify exactly what that means, but, just because they can move more air, the sound sounds more fuller, it sounds more bassier, and as a result, for a lot of people, sounds better. And I'm saying better with air quotes, you can't see that right now, but that's also very subjective, So generally speaking, a good floor stander will outperform a good bookshelf, but there are expensive bookshelves that will take the pants off cheaper floor standers.
So when I got my floor standers from you, I think that was such a debate in my head, bookshelf versus floor standers, but I went for that.
See, a lot of people get confused and they say, I don't have space. But the problem is a lot of people then buy stands. So from a sort of a surface area standpoint, they take the same amount of space. Ultimately, we have a concept, slightly sexist concept, called WAF, which is called wife acceptancy factor. So a lot of women don't like to see big dabbas in the house.
I see this in a lot of YouTube videos where they talk about this. And it's wife, but it's actually partner, right? Like,
correct.
It'll go both ways. That if you're going to put something in the living room, cosmetically, how is that going to come across?
So the term that the marketers have come up with now is called lifestyle speakers. So, for example, a Bang & Olufsen is classified as a lifestyle speaker. So it looks very good, but there are slight concessions you have to make in order to get the looks that you trade in for sound quality.
Cool. So getting back to the second system, what kind of brands are we talking and price points?
So for amplification, it's the usual suspects. Okay, you've got Marantz, Japanese. You've got Denon, Japanese. You've got Yamaha, Japanese. These typically form 80% of the sales that happen at that price point. So the Marantz 6007 is a beautiful integrated amp, very basic. The Marantz NR1200 is a two-channel receiver, which means it's a stereo setup with HDMI. And then you've got similar equivalents from Yamaha and Denon. Marantz is considered to be a premium brand, so they'll generally be more expensive than Denon and Yamaha. performance difference is fairly negligible. So if you're on a budget, go in for the Denons. They're not going to sound much different than a Marantz, you know. And in terms of speakers, unless you've got, you know, major space constraints, go in for bookshelves. For bookshelves, again, you've got two types. You've got the more accurate types, which I would typically push, say, an ELAC entry-level bookshelf, the B6.2s. You've got a NAD, which makes a brilliant speaker called the Alpha P5. So if you're looking for a more accurate sound, go in for that. Again, if you're looking for a more sort of accentuated sound, especially on the bass, go in for the Q Acoustics 3030Is. They're very popular. Between these sets of speakers, they will sort of get you what you need.
And you'd spoken something about cables. What's the deal with that?
See, the logic that I use, or the rule that I have, is 10%, not more than 10% of the cost of the system should be spent on cables. Now, especially on entry-level stuff, feel free to use Amazon Basics, etc. It's not going to make a big difference. Fancier cables might make a small difference, but they're so negligible a lot of the time that the results become slightly psychosomatic. So you've just spent 20 grand on cables, and now you have to convince yourself that the system sounds better.
Yeah, and for people who are not familiar with this, cables is such a big debated topic in the audiophile industry, where people are talking about cables that are 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 for one
Correct.
pair of speaker cables. But yeah.
So to give you an example, just the other day I got a call from a customer. He picked up a set of Q Acoustics active bookshelves. And so what happens with active bookshelves is that one speaker is powered, the other speaker is passive. So you run a cable from the powered speaker to the passive speaker to power that passive speaker. So he said, listen, the cables that came along with to connect the two look very, blah. What should I do? I said, boss, just cut a Amazon Basics. That's good enough. His next question was, I usually advise that you don't get spades or plugs, because technically, in the guys that I've learned from, they've always told me that bare wire will give you more surface area and is generally something recommended. So his next question was, okay, I agree, but what happens when the exposed section gets oxidized? Now, the answer here basically is that, this is getting in a little too, the straightforward answer is just chop it off and, splice a little more cable and plug it in. But there are some guys who like to get into this. If you like to get into this, invest in fancy cable, because it will keep you occupied for a very long time.
And then a fancier cable will come up.
Correct. So, but my general consensus is for most people is don't get into the cables aspect. Buy basic cable. Don't buy shit cable.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't let if you're doing your house, this happens a lot when I do commercial installations or house installations. Don't let your electrician contractor decide what cable is to be used. Okay. Because he's going to pick utter garbage. But don't fall for the guy who says, listen, you need, 16 gauge, 50,000 rupees a spindle cable, because it's not going to make a difference. You're not going to be able to tell. And unfortunately, margins on cables are very high. So you make a ton of money. So at Revolver Club, a mistake I've made, which I can't get out of now, is we sell cables at cost. Which then later on, a couple of guys came to me and said, why are you doing that? You could make so much money. But I feel bad, because it's basically a rip-off. There are other accessories in the audiophile game which are just a total, like they have stands. There are guys who make wooden blocks that keep the speaker cable above the ground.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Okay, that cost $400 a pop.
That's mad.
There's people who buy them, obviously. That's the only reason they're making them. So, there's gold-plated, anti-oxidized, oxidized by, 72 virgins and brought in, and etc., etc. Don't get caught up in the hoopla. Buy simple stuff. Trust your ears, and I think you should be good.
So, a lot of times you've spoken about the source, right?
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to digital, whether it's Bluetooth or you kept saying streamers. So, what's the difference between me just playing something from Bluetooth versus you using a streamer that has a Tidal Connect or a Spotify Connect, and how does that change the audio experience?
So this is, again, what I'm going to say is potentially going to change every month. The protocols being used to transmit Bluetooth on paper have slightly more losses than a lot of the Wi-Fi stuff. So technically speaking, when you transmit data over Bluetooth, there's going to be more loss of data than there will be of Wi-Fi. So when you see something like Spotify Connect, it's transmitting via Wi-Fi. Whereas Bluetooth, there's various levels of Bluetooth, LDAC, etc., etc. Now there's a sort of a high-res Bluetooth available. I think Techniques and a couple of small other brands have launched stuff. But generally speaking, as far as possible, look for Wi-Fi streaming as opposed to Bluetooth streaming. Not just because of the quality, but because of the limits associated in terms of distance with Bluetooth. See, with Bluetooth, you need to be within 10, 15 feet of the system. With Wi-Fi, as long as you're connected to Wi-Fi, the system will play.
And what kind of streamers are we talking about?
So popular, very, very popular for us are the Blue Sounds. So Blue Sound is owned by NAD. They make something called the Note 2i. That's very, very popular. Currently no stock, but that's a Swiss Army knife. It's got every possible connection you need, and it works for most people. On the expensive side, entry level wise, there are a lot of sort of chi-fi brands coming out. So you've got brands like Relic, etc. $200 odd, you can get a decent streamer with both Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, the whole 9 yards. The other option is obviously to buy an amplifier with the streaming built in. So when I was talking about those 2-channel stereo amplifiers, they all come with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. So you're set up there. They've got all the possible Spotify Connects, etc. So you're good to go.
Also, with these streamers that have Wi-Fi and Tidal Connect or any of these kind of Connect services, basically the audio path is not going from your phone. When I decide to play a particular song, that song is going from my Wi-Fi router, the signal, to the amp directly. My
Correct.
phone is not getting involved at all.
It's bypassing your phone DAC, basically.
Yeah. I don't think we should get into DACs right now. It'll be an hour more of talk of DACs. Maybe another episode for season 2.
Yeah.
Couple of more things. Give me your top 3 albums to listen to. And when I say listen to, like, where you just end up discovering things and you realize how fun or detailed or engaging an album can be.
So, you're not going to like the answer here. I'm not really one of those guys who gets into details. Okay, I'm a rock and roll guy.
Yeah.
I like garage rock. I like Zeppelin. I like live Zeppelin. I like loud drums and I like, distortion pedals. I've never liked Pink Floyd. A lot of people are going to be, listening to this thinking, what's wrong with this guy? But I could just never get into them. There's too much stuff going on. I'm not a progressive guy. So for me, it was always about, for me, I was a Zeppelin dude growing up. And for me, Zeppelin was obviously Jimmy Page and John Bonham. Now, and John Bonham had balls. Okay. So whenever I listen to a system, the first thing I evaluate is what would Zeppelin sound like on here. I don't listen to. I mean, I do listen to stuff like Pink Floyd-ish, but that's not the barometer for me when I'm evaluating a system. I'll never put on a Pink Floyd unless the customer says, "Listen, can I please listen to, Dark Side of the Moon or Time or some other, where he's like, oh wow, I can hear the." So for me, when I evaluate a system, I'll put on a Zeppelin. Zeppelin albums surprisingly are very, very, very well produced. Jimmy Page was, if you listen to When the Levee Breaks on Zeppelin 4. That with that iconic sort of start, that was recorded in an elevator shaft. That's how he got the depth. So he was a pioneer in his own way, but he didn't go overboard. So there's not like hundreds of overdubs going on, but he did things, and there's a level of simplicity that he used with 4 mics and 5 mics that people now try to do with 32 mics, and it's just an overkill. So for me, if I had to pick 3 albums to evaluate a system, one would be a Zeppelin album. Either, anywhere from 1 to 4. 1 if you want a blues rock, more sort of hardy album. And maybe 4 if you want something more refined. 3 if you're looking for something slightly more acoustic. I think the second album would be what we spoke about, Random Access Memories. I think that's a seminal recording. I don't think it gets much better than that in terms of putting your system through its paces, because it's got everything.
It's got everything, literally, that whole album.
So that's definitely, if you get into records, buy that album.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be saying this because we can never keep enough stock. And I keep getting galis from customers like, boss, it's always sold out. But buy that album. Third, I'm a White Stripes guy. Jack White is fully analog. Elephant, which has Ball and Biscuit and a bunch of other famous tracks, I believe including Seven Nation Army. That's the album to buy. Okay, fully analog, fully rock and roll. 2 guys, a drummer and a guitarist. It doesn't get better than that. And then obviously you're more than welcome to pick up like a Pink Floyd or whatever. But
Pink Floyd-ish.
Yeah, Pink
you
Floyd,
say.
and the Eagles, Hotel California, which I can't.
So since you've given us your dislike of the term warmth and Pink Floyd,
I don't dislike Pink Floyd. I think that I've always been a closet hipster. So because everybody I meet was like, boss, Pink Floyd, Pink Floyd, Pink Floyd, mentally I was just like, not going to listen to Pink
So
Floyd.
what I was going to say is, so recently I got a vintage Japanese amp through Jude. He was able to source some from someone in Bangalore.
Yeah.
So I purchased a 44-year-old 1978 model of a Luxman amp. My speaker system has not sounded warmer ever in my life. So I was going to tell you should come over. I'll make you listen to a really warm, hugging speaker system, and we'll listen to Comfortably Numb on that.
For sure. With some substances maybe.
Yeah. Okay, coming towards the end of the episode, Jude, tell me one niche thing you're into apart from audio.
I'm into a lot. I think that the niche thing that has destroyed me financially is I sort of have a slight affinity for like late 1990s, early 2000s BMWs. And so that's really my hobby. So
that's amazing.
So I've got an E38, which is considered to be the best looking 7 series of all time. I have an E39, the best looking 5 series of all time. And I have an E36, the best looking 3 series of all time. But that's something I don't advise anybody get into. Because they will be the single reason for you going bankrupt. Because they're very hard to keep up and running. But the satisfaction I get from saying that one day they'll be fully operational and everything will work and there'll be no check lights on the dashboard, that's really what keeps me going.
Fun.
And recently I've been getting into watches. So
yeah, we were discussing that.
So I just picked up this Seiko Pogue.
Yeah.
And that's I think something I'm also going to get into, but I'm going to keep it fairly tight.
Well, this is a podcast, but both of us are wearing Seikos, and there will be an episode on watches as well.
Awesome.
Great. Before we end, can you tell us your Instagram social media handles?
Yeah, so it's The Revolver Club for Instagram and Facebook, and it's TRC India for Twitter.
Great. And they actually have a very active community, even on mailers. Like I think you send out mailers 2-3 times a week. I end up spending a lot of money because
once a week. I try to keep it down. Don't say that. People think I'm trying to spam them.
Okay.
Once a week. Follow us on Instagram, and there's a link on all on our website, etc. for featured vinyl heads. Featured vinyl heads get you 10% off on records for life, plus access to the community. So fill in that form and become a featured vinyl head. It doesn't cost you anything.
And that's the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Jude, for being a part of this. And look forward to a lot more vinyls.
Thanks for having me on, Aneesh. It was fun.
Cheers.